Hello and welcome back to Health Unlocked, the power of salutogenesis with Jason. Jason, how are you?
Not too bad.
Jason is modest enough to not tell that he just went through a procedure and it's a little bit painful.
Yes. and as we discussed, it's somewhat ironic that that was the industry that I changed, which was laser lithotripsy.
Yeah.
So make sure you drink a lot of water so you don't get kidney stones. They're not much fun.
Exactly. But today we are going to, I would say, like a follow-up conversation to the previous episode that we did. We had a lot of discussion on DSI last episode, but today we want to talk about really more on how the regulations work and what kind of licenses or credentials you need to go through to get to the market. So the device that isn't a drug, which is, we're going to talk about IBAL, how that might be rewriting the rules of medicine. So Jason, let's start with the first question here. First of all, many people assume that if something supports health, it must be a drug, which is or a supplement, which is many times not the case. So what makes eyeball different, and why might it fit into another category?
So you're right. Most people think that when you're sick, you need a drug. And we think that supplements are more suited for kind of background wellness. They're slower and more general, not really what you'd reach for when the stakes are high. Eyeball's really different than both of those. It's truly a micronutrient matrix. It doesn't push biochemistry the way that a drug does. It really just supplies cofactors that the body already uses to keep the local terrain resilient. And that means that it could and should qualify under the FDA's definition of or as a medical device. And so I guess kind of the way, a good way to think of it is think of it as like scaffolding. So it doesn't build the wall. It just holds the structure so that the wall can be set. And that really is a different category than either a drug or a supplement.
Okay. And I guess the question is fundamentally, how does FDA makes a judgment whether something is considered a drug at all?
Yeah. Okay. So it really is determined by how it works. So the mechanism of action. If it works via pharmacological, metabolic, or immunological, that's PMI, means or effect, if the product actually changes your biology through one of those routes, then it's a drug. So pharmacological means that you're like binding to receptors like blood pressure pills. Metabolic means that it's altering how the cells actually run or use energy, like glucose or cholesterol drugs. And immunological means that it's directly revving up or suppressing, I suppose, the immune system, like vaccines. And now here's kind of the twist with eyeball. Eyeball may look metabolic because mitochondria then end up working better when nutrient or specifically cofactor sufficiency is restored. But that's not actually altering metabolism. It's simply supplying missing cofactors. The FDA cares about mechanism more than outcome. And so if you're restoring the conditions rather than forcing pathways, you may fit under the umbrella of a device.
And eyeball is different. So it's this, can you expand that in terms of eyeball now?
Yes. So longtime listeners should already be a little bit familiar with the microimmune dynamics, where healing depends on kind of four capacities. We've got nutrient sufficiency, redox balance, mitochondrial flexibility, and resolution competency. The last three of those all really depend on the first, the nutrient sufficiency. If you don't have nutrient sufficiency, specifically metallic cofactor sufficiency, the others kind of collapse. Eyeball's designed as that nutrient matrix to restore that foundation. From there, redox balance can stabilize, mitochondria can shift phenotypes well, and the immune responses can actually be completed. And, in contrast, cryogenic drugs often jam kind of one of those levers. IBAL more kind of, tightens all four of the legs on the table, so it can stand well. And that's microimmune restoration, letting the system progress naturally instead of stalling within the healing cycle.
So this bypasses the the metabolic, and the immunol. It's still immune related risk action, right? So it should be still impacting the eye in the PMI.
No. So it's not forcing anything to happen immunologically. So when the FDA is saying that something is immunological, what you're really doing is you're forcing the immune system to have a specific response against something. That's not what IBAL is doing at all. But does it make your immune system work better? Yes. Does it make your metabolism work better? Yeah. But it's not forcing either one of those.
Okay. So, and by that definition, it bypasses and qualifies probably under a device definition.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, if now the follow up to that, if IBAL does not act through the PMI means, what kind of mechanism does it use instead?
So that was what we just talked about, right? So the four capacities: the nutrient sufficiency, redox balance, mitochondrial flexibility, and resolution competency.
Yeah, I guess we go towards devices, like from the now, let's say it goes through, it qualifies as a device. So now,
Yes.
how would the process will look like now that it is, let's say, qualifies as a device? What will change on the regulation side?
Oh, okay. So, that's okay. So here now the difference is night and day between drug development and medical device development. Drugs typically take, over a decade, up to 15 years to develop, and can cost north of $1 billion. Devices are often cleared in just a year or two for under a few $1 million if it's novel, and oftentimes less than $1 million if there's a predicate device. And that's important because it decides really who can get access, right? $1 billion drug gets priced for investors, and a few $1 million drug, or I'm sorry, a few $1 million device can reach far more people. Think of it kind of like building a skyscraper versus a house. That's really the difference there, right? Both require safety checks, but one takes a decade and $1 billion, and then the other can be built safely within a year. So if you need shelter now, which pathway you choose can really change lives.
Yeah, and this outside of the cost, I guess, and you did touch upon, I think, the time frame, right? The time frame cuts down significantly, right? So
Yeah.
how big is that difference, like time frame wise? Like if you go this route now, device route, what's that? Going to market.
Well, so a drug can take over a decade to develop, and whereas a medical device can take less than a year if we go through the 510(k) pathway. That's basically an equivalence pathway. So basically, that's where you've got a predicate device, and you might be doing something a little bit different, but it's close enough to that predicate device that you can just tell the FDA that, okay, my device is very similar to that. And then you have to go through a few safety checks here and there, but it's not really that big a deal because they already understand it fairly well. If it's a de novo device, then that means that you're developing something that hasn't existed before, and it's dramatically different, but it's still a device. That's going to take probably a few years, but nowhere near a decade. That could take maybe 3 years or so. So yeah, the time frame is significantly better for a medical device, and part of that is because medical devices, the safety level is significantly better, or they're significantly more safe. another way to look at that is the safety concerns with drugs can be unknown, right? You don't really know what's going to happen with long-term use. Whereas with a medical device that's acting in a physical manner, well, it's fairly straightforward what the safety issues are.
And do you think are there any other different bottlenecks that you run into outside of the time and the cost on devices side? Because there's a whole bunch of barriers you have to go from quality assurance to whatnot on other side when you go through as a drug, right? But on the device side, once you take this route outside of the cost, time, and any unknown bottlenecks that could come into anything that you're aware of?
Well, I mean, there are some other differences. Like even the quality system that the company has to follow to go through the development process and even the manufacturing. It's there's a different quality system control, and generally it's well, actually most people in the world call it, or most countries in the world follow the ISO 1345. That's the medical device quality system regulations, and they're pretty compliant with the FDA's as well. Whereas if you're going to go the drug pathway, it's good manufacturing practices, and it can get significantly more complicated. But that all just really comes down to the time that it takes to develop the drug and the cost. Right. So yeah, there are a bunch of things that will be significantly easier, but in the end, those are all reflected in the time that it takes to develop and the cost that it takes.
Got it. So what kind of interventions have previously been classified as medical devices that people might not expect? Are there precedents that help clarify where IBAL might fit, that you already know clear path of it?
Well, actually, so here's actually something that's interesting. So toothpaste is actually a good example of how similar products can fall into entirely different regulatory categories depending on how they work, right? So a standard natural toothpaste that doesn't have fluoride in it is considered a cosmetic. So that's not that the FDA doesn't care, but that's not a drug, that's not a supplement, and it's not a medical device. And since it only cleans and polishes the teeth. Once you add fluoride, it becomes an over-the-counter drug because fluoride acts through a PMI mechanism, right? It actually alters the enamel by integrating fluoride ions, making the enamel more acid resistant. And then, by contrast, toothpaste for sensitive teeth, for example, those containing potassium nitrate or something else, they can be classified as a medical device, and that's because they act physically, not pharmacologically. They actually they plug up the dentinal tubules and block the nerve stimulation. So you can have really toothpaste be classified differently depending on how it works. In one case, all it's doing is polishing teeth. In one case, it's actually has some pharmacological mechanism, and then in one case, it's purely physical in how it works. But more specifically, if you're asking, are there predicate devices for IBAL products? Yeah. So they're multiple antimicrobial and wound healing products that exploit the oligodynamic effect of metal ions to kill microbes. So yeah, there are multiple predicate devices, especially for the ion gel ZCM25, which is currently the only IBAL based medical product. And they're some of them use silver ions, some use copper ions. Others are using sulfate sulfates for redox improvement. So yes, there are predicate devices.
And why do you think more innovators haven't taken this device classification route. If it's faster, saves time, gets to market faster, especially when working in immune or mitochondrial health, specifically in these areas.
Okay, well, to start with, it has to fit correctly, right? So it has to, I mean, if it's salutogenic, then you're right. That almost by definition means it's not acting in a PMI manner. But just because something is not acting in a PMI manner doesn't mean that you can't go through the drug development process. And I guess some of this is partly culture and partly confidence, right? So most biotech leaders are trained to think that drugs are the only serious option for like chronic diseases and real significant things. And investors then kind of reinforce that, and they assume that bigger markets mean drugs, and then that's going to give you a bigger return on investment. But I guess here's the truth, right? The FDA's own definitions kind of open the door for supportive interventions to be devices. And then, but really pursuing that path does take confidence. And you have to argue your science clearly and stand firm when regulators push back, assuming that it is truly not acting in a pharmacological, metabolic, or immunological effect. And a lot of companies end up not really even trying. But on top of that, most of the things that people are working on, most of they're biologics, and they actually are working in a PMI manner, in which case they should be a drug. They are a cryogenic drug. But again, if you know the framework, and you know your mechanisms of action, and that's what you're claiming, and they are not PMI, and you believe in that, then you can make that case. So at least at this point, the team behind IBAL does feel pretty strongly that our products are not PMI effect.
That's a good news, and that's a good news, right? We should. We're hoping that it gets into the heads of more and more people faster, and that definitely is going to help us get there. So some people might even say that if IBAL is made of nutrients, and isn't it just another vitamin formula? So how would you respond to that?
Well, so I guess vitamins and really more specifically in this case would be mineral supplements. They're kind of broad and slow, right? Take a pill, hope it absorbs well, and sometime later, it shifts biomarker. IBAL's different than that. It's engineered as a matrix that delivers cofactors directly to where they're needed. That bypasses the complications of digestion and then systemic circulation, right? And that's why it may qualify as a device platform, not a supplement. And actually, I suppose I should back up and mention that there is a caveat that I didn't mention before. The FDA basically has a clause that if you want to make a medical claim on anything that you ingest, regardless of how it works, they do define that as a drug. And to some extent, almost anything that you ingest, you do have to metabolize. So your body has to change it, in which case it really is involving metabolism there, almost necessarily. And then that should be classified as a drug. But I mean, I understand the thought, right? Because IBAL's mechanisms are closer to a salutogenic supplement than a cryogenic drug. But since it doesn't have to be ingested, we will be able to classify it as a medical device and make the medical claim, even though it's acting more like a supplement. Would that make sense?
Yes, but would that mean if the same formulation or same things, if you have to somehow ingest it and you make something, then that's it, then it won't qualify as med device. In that case, you will have to pursue it as a drug.
Well, I suspect that you wouldn't ever want to ingest IBAL because it's highly antimicrobial. And unless it gets absorbed in your stomach and then basically doesn't pass out of your stomach, but if it does pass out of the stomach and it stays intact and you've still got the zinc and copper ions and the sulfates, it's going to destroy your microbiome or your gut microbiome. And that's probably not going to be something that you want. Now, it's also possible that it doesn't destroy it enough, in which case maybe, but I don't know. I have a hard time seeing that as a good pathway because, for it to actually be able to get absorbed within the body, I don't see the ingestion as a pathway that's necessary, right? So with the pharmacokinetic testing that we've done, we actually showed that infusion. Now there's a limit on the maximum concentration that we can use for infusion because it is somewhat acidic. And if you get too acidic in what you're infusing, you can collapse veins. So there's a minimum, or I'm sorry, there's a maximum concentration, and that's actually fairly low. Whereas the topical concentration that we can use is actually fairly high. DCM 20 or DCM 25 means actually 25% concentration. So that's actually really high. But the pharmacokinetic testing showed that there was essentially the same increase in the zinc, copper, and magnesium ions in the bloodstream, measured, I think it was an hour afterwards. And it was the same concentration as infusion. So if we can get just as much into the bloodstream by using it topically, I don't see a reason to try to ingest it or infuse it for that matter. Now, nebulization and an injection, say directly into a tumorous cancer, those are going to be different. And I actually think that those probably are good.
So because it provides it creates that environment where tissues can, use it, that environment that created by IBAL, that's what makes it qualify as medical device platform rather than a supplement itself.
Yes. The FDA, well, and I guess more than that is it's also already in the bioavailable form. So I guess I'd have to look at that a lot more. It's possible that even if this were to be ingested for some reason, it might still be able to qualify as a medical device because no metabolism is needed. Now, again, in most cases, like when you take minerals, you're taking mineral salts or something along those lines. And then your digestion actually has to metabolize it and strip the ions off, separate it from whatever the salt was. And that process is metabolic in nature. That's not needed for IBAL. So maybe it's possible. But at this point, I still just say, we're probably never going to make, well, maybe you should never say never, right? At this point, I don't anticipate ever having an IBAL product that would be ingestible, but I guess it's not impossible. And the other thing that's really exciting about all of this is there is a pathway to turn a medical device into a drug. And that's basically after you've developed the medical device and it's been on the market and you've got a bunch of surveillance data that's telling you a bunch of things about it, and then you realize that, hey, my medical device is actually doing something else, and the something else that it's doing, to make the claims for whatever that is, it might be better for it to be classified as a drug. So you can actually convert a medical device into a drug, and it's significantly easier than if you were just developing the drug in the first place. And part of that's because you actually know a lot of safety. You've already developed this product and people have been using it. So you should understand the safety pretty well.
Right. Okay. And I guess looking ahead, what it means for access and equity if more interventions like IBAL were, developed as a device instead of drugs, what will it change, or what would be the impact, I guess?
Yeah, so this is where I get kind of excited, and I understand this whole episode is a little bit dry for most people probably, but this is where I did get excited. So most people don't realize that that the delivery, right, doesn't that's not what decides classification. Meaning, whether it's injectable or nebulizable. If the mechanism isn't pharmacological, metabolic, or immunologic, then whatever you're developing can still be a device. That means that IBAL doesn't have to, remain a gel. It doesn't have to stay the topical ion gel ECM25 to be a medical device, right? It might truly be able to serve as a device platform. So imagine the implications here. You've got, yes, the wound gels, inhaled applications, and even injectables for oncology. So think about what that would mean, right? If an injectable breast cancer intervention could qualify as a device. From a humanitarian perspective, it could save lives much more quickly. From an investor's perspective, it could be developed for millions of dollars in a few years rather than, billions in over a decade. And the ramifications of that are fairly enormous. Most people don't really see that at first. But once you grasp the FDA's own definitions, the possibilities really are kind of wide open here for access, equity, and yes, even value creation. And to circle back to the last episode, there's a much greater chance of IBAL-based interventions or micronutrient matricy inventions or interventions being suitable for DeSci development, decentralized science development. So that's really exciting. It means it'll take a lot less money and time and even effort, and we can get this stuff out and start helping people as soon as possible.
Yeah. And I guess investor stakes, right? Like that changes too because of how the process is done. And do you think you will get like this is a path more supported by investors versus not?
So that's a tough one because for what we're trying to target, normally those things are targeted by drug. And so it's a completely different story to try and tell somebody how you can have this type of efficacy, which is, if we take the ion gel and go back to just wound healing, well, it's been healing wounds that standard of care gave up on. So that's significantly better efficacy than the drugs that exist. But so most people are asking the question, well, wait, how can you be getting better than cryogenic drug efficacy from a medical device? That doesn't make any sense to them. There's some resistance there for sure. Then on top of that, investors, it depends on how you want to look at it, right? In one case, investors can look at this and say, oh, well, drug development, that's really risky. Something like over 90% of all drugs fail the development process because they end up being too expensive to manufacture based on what you could sell them, or their safety signals that weren't clear in the beginning, and it turns out, that the risks aren't worth it, for this particular, that particular drug. And it costs a whole ton of money. And so you're putting a lot on the line. Now, with medical devices, their risk is actually significantly lower than even the business risk. So it's much more likely that a medical device will get approved. And some of that is because they are significantly safer. So the fallout from safety is much lower. So yeah, how to answer that? I don't really know. it has been tough trying to talk to investors because honestly, most people don't believe it. This is part of the reason why I had to go through and really figure out microimmune dynamics in the first place. Because to get a drug developed or a medical device, you have to prove efficacy and safety. You don't have to know how it works at all. Well, for a drug, you don't have to know how it works. For a medical device, you have to be able to say it works via something that is physical or physical chemical, not pharmacological, metabolic, or immunologic. So, but let's stay on drugs there. You don't have to know how it works. But it's really difficult to raise the amount of money that it takes to develop a drug if all you can say is, oh, well, it works. I don't know why. It just does. Most people don't want to risk all that money. Whereas with a medical device, you've got a bunch of things going for you. One, you have to know how it works well enough to say that it's not PMI, and it's going to take much less money, and it's going to be much faster. Now, investors might still look at that and say, I'd still like it to be a drug, though, because then it can command, there's a bigger moat to keep others from developing something similar, and it can command more when you sell it.
Yeah.
And again, that's why I think that this might fit really, really well with decentralized science that is a little bit more in line with what's doing what's good for humanity, not necessarily only looking at somebody's pocket.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's the hope. If we can get this, it looks like it's a viable path, and that's why this is exciting in both the combination of DeSci and going through the device path makes it looks like it's very possible to go and fast, hopefully. So that's why it's exciting to see, this is why this episode looks like a little slightly off topic, but it is important to understand that this fast tracks the things that we talked about in previous episode, right? So what do you do after you've done the things that you discussed in the previous episode to now on what's next it needs to happen, right? So,
so I'm fairly confident that I'm very confident that we can take the ion gel and go through the medical device 510K process in the U.S., get that approved as a medical device. It's already approved as a medical device in Mexico and the UAE. So the precedent's already been set. They looked at it and understand, oh yeah, this isn't really, in terms of its antimicrobial properties and wound healing properties, which that's all that's being claimed for that product. It's not it's not anything too far outside of what's already been being done. We're just using zinc, copper, and sulfates together, whereas most of the predicate devices are using silver ion, which actually is significantly less safe than using, right? Because silver is not supposed to be in the body; it's not an essential ion. So they're using silver or copper or sulfates. We're just using zinc, copper, and sulfates all at the same time, along with some magnesium. And there are reasons for that. But the claims that are being made are simply antimicrobial and antioxidation. That's it.
Yeah.
And that should be relatively easy to get a 510K on. And then once we've got lots of safety data and nobody can argue with in the US, then we can start developing other products that do different things. An injectable for breast cancer, or for any tumorous cancer, or even a topical for non-melanoma skin cancer, or psoriasis, or so on and so forth. And I'm hoping that in the 510K process, we'll be able to add more complex wound treatments specifically for diabetic foot ulcer, which, while that's not technically what it is approved for. That's what it's being used on a lot in Mexico. And again, we're showing efficacy better than anything else. And we've talked about this a bunch. It's almost exclusively, that was hard for me to say. It's almost exclusively being used on wounds, diabetic wounds that failed conventional treatment. And then they were going to amputate anyway. So they said, sure, try that medical device. And we haven't found one yet where it failed. I mean, that's significant.
Yeah, it's huge.
So yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. Well, this thanks for sharing more insights on how this works, the next steps kind of for IBAL after how do we get to the market, I guess. So before we close today's conversation, how can our listeners help on this end?
Well, even though it's significantly less expensive for development, it still costs a few million. So we do need to raise money. I am looking into decentralized science. I've been talking to a few of the companies that are kind of already established in there, and hopefully we're going to create a tokenized research project that actually really looks at the microimmune dynamics and then the microimmune fatigue cycle, or actually, I guess I should start calling that the microimmune fatigue continuum, because it's not really a cycle, it's more of a continuum. And to really show how that is basically, as the local terrain starts to break down, that then causes the CDR progression to start stalling more and more. That increases senescent cell creation and or increases the chances of through CDR persistence, which then becomes chronic disease. And then the next step would be to show that a microimmune nutrient matrix can cause the recovery or restoration of that local immune terrain, and at the cells that basically their CDR progression go back to normal. The other thing that we can do, right? So that's all kind of stepping backwards a little bit and looking at kind of the science behind really what's happening at the cellular level. And why is it that simply taking these cofactors and giving them to the cells allows the cells to function more properly? We can also go the other way and put together an IPNFT on the 510K for the ion gel and bring it into the US. That would actually, it seems to me that would be kind of huge for the DeSci environment and movement entirely, because this would be the first ever regulatory approval that DeSci funded. And you would think that would mean a lot. So I'm hoping that we could actually go both of those pathways, basically one kind of backwards and one kind of forwards. But yeah, I find that really exciting as well.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep you posted, our listeners, in the next steps, how things are progressing through the pod, and of course, everything hopefully goes in direction you want. And once the project also goes live, we'll keep you posted, so how we can let our viewers know listeners know how they can help us and engage with us and support the project. And we'll keep all this information. But for now, we'll call it a day. Thanks again for sharing all the insights. Much appreciated. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.